We have completed about 1/3 of the book of Judges. We pointed out that this period of history following Moses and Joshua lasted about 300 years. That's a rather long time. And the stories that the book of Judges include are not necessarily a full history, but they were selected incidents that teach a story. And the story is quite simple. Israel had been given everything it needed to be a successful, happy, and productive country. What they needed to do was to follow the covenant that they had made with God, which, if you make it very simple, was they would follow His word and He would give them success in all that they would do. The book of Judges opened with the tribes attempting to finish what Joshua had started. Finish conquering the promised land, the land that had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What we learned in that first section on the book of Judges was that the tribes started out very good, but then got a little bit lazy and decided it was far better to live among the idolaters than to drive them out. We went through a number of cycles covering half of the book or the time of the Judges last time. By the end of this period, the quality of the Judges had eroded somewhat. The Judges weren't ideally what God intended, but they were nevertheless raised up by God to deliver the people when they had fallen into idolatry, been invaded by a foreign country, put into temporary slavery anywhere from 7 to 20 years. They cried out to the Lord for help, and He sent them a judge. The last judge that we discussed was a pair, actually, a man and a woman, Barak and Deborah. We're now in the middle of the book of Judges, and as you can see from this slide, the people were beginning to consider the wrong kind of king. Did they have a king? Certainly. God in heaven was their king, and He had made a covenant with them. But now, as they went through these periods of invasion and deliverance, the people wanted to be like all the other nations, to have a king, a powerful man, who would bring, they thought, stability to their life. They were foolish and they were wrong. In this middle part of the book of Judges, we find that there was one judge who was extraordinary. He was a leader of men. He was successful in battle. His name was Gideon. When he came to the end of his life, the people offered him a crown. Be our king. And Gideon gave the right answer. He says, no, God is your king. However, words don't mean anything if they're not backed up with fact. Gideon had lots of children, and one of them was by a concubine who was, yes, a Canaanite, a pagan, an idol worshiper. And this half-Israelite, half-idolater king, or boy, had a name which reveals Gideon's heart. His name was Abimelech. Now in Hebrew that means, my father is king. What? Gideon had said, I don't want to be a king. And yet he names his son, my father is king. Let's enter into this story, and it'll be carried forward to that time in the book of Judges where deliverance no longer gave rest to the land. God had given periods of 40 to 80 years of rest at the beginning of the book of Judges. But after Gideon, there wasn't that kind of rest anymore. In fact, God had to raise up a judge here, there, and everywhere to simply hold the country together. Let's look now at the story of Gideon. Our map shows us the Promised Land, the section between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see that Gideon's home, Ophrah, was almost dead center in the country. We also have a symbol there of crossed swords, which show the important battle, the battle at the hill of Moreh. And the cartoon here tells us and reminds us of the story when Gideon blew the horns and called the people to battle. The amazing thing about Gideon was that he led the armies of Israel across the Jordan and deep into Arabia, where the battle at Karkar cemented his reputation as being a mighty warrior. The invader that God sent after Deborah and Barak were a desert-dwelling people who traveled on camels, and they came into the land at harvest time and ravaged the crops and made the people desperate because they didn't have anything to live on. For 7 years, these desert invaders troubled Gideon, his family, and the whole people of Israel. On this particular picture, we see an idol and someone worshiping it. And that's where our story begins. Judges 6, verse 2 points out that Midian was so powerful that the Israelites took refuge in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. This kind of invasion and raiding still exists in many parts of the world. And when you have your crops destroyed, you're in real difficulty. And yet they went through 7 years of that and cried out to the Lord for help. The scripture reminds us that the Midianites were not alone. They were accompanied also by the Amalekites, who had attacked Israel on the way out of Egypt, and other eastern peoples. So this was a major problem for Israel. They did not spare a living thing for the Israelites. We're about the middle of the story of the 12 judges. We're told that Midian impoverished the people. Of course, if you have no crops, you have no wealth. They cried out to the Lord for help, and God sent them a prophet. We don't know that prophet's name, but he had a simple message. I brought you out of Egypt. I can rescue you from this problem as well. Gideon is judge number 5. We're told that he was doing some threshing. Threshing is separating the grain from the kernels so that you can make flour and bread. The strange thing was that Gideon was not doing it out in the open, but actually doing that in a wine press, which is a very small area, but hidden away probably among the rocks so that the Midianites could not see. We're told that the Lord came to Gideon. Gideon didn't know exactly who this stranger was that appeared to him, and yet the message that the angel of the Lord said to Gideon was, "The Lord is with you," and then he calls him a mighty warrior. This came as a shock to Gideon because he was the least important member of a clan that had no particular importance in the tribe of Manasseh. So why in the world would an angel be calling him a mighty warrior? Gideon is an interesting character. It's one of the judges in this part of Scripture whose character is revealed to us through many incidents and many things that happen. Gideon's response to the fact that he was a mighty warrior was, "Excuse me, Lord, I don't understand. If we have mighty warriors and I'm one of them, why do we have all this problem? Why has the Lord not been on our side? Why have all these things happened to us?" And in fact, he had made the conclusion that the Lord had abandoned his people. Already in the book of Joshua, we learned how God said, "Do not rely on your own strength, but rely on the fact that I am with you." Remember how Joshua defeated Jericho, not by might of arms, but by God's almighty power. And now this angel from God said to him, "Gideon, you worry too much about the details. Go and fight for the Lord with the strength that you have. I'm sending you." Isn't that enough? When you go from language to language, sometimes you can't pick up the small but important details. Gideon talked to this heavenly stranger the way a merchant would talk in the marketplace, arguing or haggling over the details. So when the English says, "Pardon me," it really is, let's talk about this some more. How can I possibly be a mighty warrior and save Israel? God's answer to that question was quite simple. It's the one that God gave to Moses at the burning bush and gave to Joshua also. If you're going to be a mighty warrior, it's because I, God, will be with you. As I said before, Gideon was a kind of interesting individual who didn't take things exactly the first time as they were said. All right, so I'm a mighty warrior and you want me to deliver Israel, but it would be very helpful if you gave me a sign, something to convince me that this is true. The first sign that God gave was He took Gideon's offering of a young goat and some bread. And when Gideon put it on the altar, poof, in a flash of flame, it disappeared. This slide basically simply pictures this fact. And Gideon's eyes were wide open. He was talking to a heavenly messenger, and this was serious business. Stories like the one of Gideon bring us insights that sometimes suddenly appear in the text. Gideon had been sort of bargaining with God, asking him to prove it. But now that he had seen the sign that he asked for, he was very much afraid. He concluded that he had seen the God of heaven and earth face to face, and that this certainly meant that he would die. Throughout the Old Testament, the response of God's people when they see the grace and forgiveness of God is often to build an altar. And that's what Gideon did. He built an altar to the Lord, and he gave it a name. The Lord is peace. This whole episode was meant by God to be an answer to the problem that the Israelites had with the invading Midianites. And that altar, we're told, remained in his hometown the rest of his life. Building an altar to the Lord at a time when his people were also building altars to idols meant that Gideon had to finish the work that was begun that evening. And it was to take the second bull from his father's animals, 7-year-old, tear down the altar that his father had built to an idol, and cut down the Asherah pole, which was an object of worship to the female deity, and rearrange everything so that Gideon's home property now only had an altar to the true God. Destruction of the idol altar came first. Gideon was fearful that this might cause problems for his hometown and its people. Obviously, this altar to the idols, both male and female, was something that the people thought a lot about. And if they found it missing, Gideon knew that he would be in trouble. And so it happened on the next morning. The people did notice that the altar to the male god and the pole to the female god were missing. They were gone. They had been destroyed. And in its place was an altar to the true God. They asked a question, the people of the town, who did this? And they found quickly that it was Gideon, the son of Joash. And their solution to what they saw was that Gideon would pay for this by being executed. Gideon was not executed. Gideon's father, the one who had built the pagan altars, the idol worship place, used common sense. He said to the people, if your idolatrous God is so powerful, let him settle matters with my son Gideon. Don't you take it into your own hands to execute him. This whole event of Gideon destroying the altar of the idol worshippers gave him a new nickname. You see it there. He's often referred to this in the Old Testament, Jerubbaal. What it means is let Baal, the male god, fight for himself. His given name, the one his father had given him, was Gideon, which means the one who hacks away at a problem. So here we have the two sides of this man. He is impulsive. He hacks away at problems. At one moment he's hesitant, and the next moment he's all action. But the spiritual message is this: he's one of the first Israelites at this particular time who said, I'm with the Lord, let Baal settle matters if he's able, and I know he's not. To get back to the story, the Holy Writer reminds us that destroying an altar near a winepress in the city of Ophrah was not the end of the story by any means. The Midianites and all of their allies were still there, and it was harvest time, and they were about to do their destructive acts of violence against Israel. Several times in the book of Judges we're told that God's Holy Spirit comes upon the judge and gives him the ability to do his work. It was said of Othniel, the first judge, the ideal judge. And here we have the Spirit of the Lord came to Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, which was a signal to the people. It's a small country, but you blow the trumpet in a certain way, and then people on the next hill would blow the trumpet in a certain way, and pretty soon the call to arms went out in all directions. And so tribes around Gideon, Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, mustered. They came together to fight under Gideon's leadership. Gideon is still Gideon. He wants kind of proof that if he calls together an army, will God truly fight for him and with him? So he took a fleece of wool and he laid it out on the ground. And he says, Lord, make it so that all the ground is dry, but the fleece has collected water. And in the morning, as the picture shows, Gideon was able to fill a bowl. That wasn't good enough for Gideon. He says, that may just have happened. Lord, I want to take another night and I want you to reverse the circumstances. The fleece will be dry, but the ground all around it will be wet. No problem for God. He did it. The battle that was going to happen soon was in northern Israel, in the area called the Jezreel Valley. And there's a spring that comes up there at the edge of a hill and runs down into the Jordan River, and it's the spring of Herod. Midian was encamping north of this, and Gideon was gathering his troops to the south. The story moves on not with a battle, but with God saying to Gideon, I'm sorry, but you've got too many men. 32,000 had answered the call to arms. And God says, I don't want you or anyone else to say after the battle that it was the strength of the Israelites that carried the day. So tell the people that have gathered around the spring of Herod, if they would rather not be a fighter and they're afraid of battle, tell them to go home. The army was cut from 32,000 to 10,000, but then God said, that's still too many. I'm going to cut down your fighting force from 10,000 to 300. And I'm going to do it this way. Have everybody go down to the spring to drink, and those people who lap the water like a dog, there were only 300 of them, they will be your army. God said, with these 300 men, I will give you victory. You can send all the other people home. This again is part of the story that began with Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, where it wasn't the battle tactics that won, but it was the presence of the Lord and his power. Instead of 32,000 men overwhelming the Midianites, it would be simply 300. It's happened before, it's going to happen now again. Gideon says, well, that's not very easy to do, 300 men. I'd like reassurance. And what I'm going to do is go down to the camp of the Midianites, and God said, this is okay, and take along your servant Purah and listen to how the people are talking. It's almost like the Holy Writer wants to remind us this really was something amazing that God would win his battle with 300 men, because it says here that the camels that the Midianites and their allies had couldn't be counted, and it compares it a bit of an exaggeration to the sand on the seashore. There were an awful lot of Midianites. Gideon and his servant came down on the night before the battle, and they listened into a conversation between two Midianite fighters. And one of them told his friend, I had a dream, and in this dream, a moldy barley cake rolled down the hill and overturned our tent. Gideon immediately said, I must be the moldy barley cake, and this is a sign from God that we will have a victory. Gideon's battle plan, with the Lord's approval, was to divide the 300 men into 3 bands, each of 100 men, Each man would have a torch in his hand, but he'd put the torch inside of a clay pitcher, and then he would have a horn in his other hand. I'm talking about a horn that makes noise. And this is how it was supposed to work. The torches would not give any light until the pitchers were broken. But suddenly when all the pitchers were broken, 300 of them, there'd be this flash of light all around the Midianite camp, causing fear and panic. And then the blast of the horn would compound the fear of the Midianites so that they would be disorganized. And, well, as we hear, they drew their sword and killed each other. Gideon, when everything had fallen into place, was a good leader. He said to the people, "Watch me, follow my lead, and charge the Midianites." And this is the battle cry: for the Lord and for Gideon. Again, this gives us a little insight. Gideon was not afraid to take credit for the battle, even though God had made it clear, you're not going to take the credit. It's going to be me who fights for you. So it happened exactly as Gideon had set it up. They broke the jars, making a lot of noise. Suddenly there was a flash of light, and then the horns were blasted so that the Midianites didn't know what was going on. This was at the third watch of the night. This would have been like 3 o'clock in the morning. And the battle cry that they heard everywhere was, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." This map tells us geographically what happened. Gideon's 3 companies, the 3 arrows, surrounded the Midianites. They were in panic. They struck out against shadows. They killed each other. They began to flee down the valley past the Spring of Herod, down the Jordan Valley, and into Arabia. Of course, we have no idea how many people were involved in this battle, but we're told that people started coming out of the hills and following Gideon and pursuing the Midianites on the way down to the Jordan. And the men of Ephraim were called out to be a part of the battle. The Ephraimites captured 2 of the 4 kings of the Midianites. The Ephraimites were a very proud tribe, and they basically said to Gideon, why didn't you rely on us more? Why did you call us out late in the battle? Now remember, it was God's plan that set up the battle, not Gideon's. Gideon gave a very diplomatic reply. He said, if you want to compare things, let's use the harvest. The meager harvest of my little clan is nothing compared to what you guys did when you captured 2 kings. And the Ephraimites, oh, okay. And they were satisfied temporarily. a battle and a pursuit of the enemy down into the Jordan Valley left the soldiers of Gideon hungry, tired, and thirsty. Gideon asked the people near the Jordan at a place called Sukkot, give my troops some bread. Why should we give bread to your troops when two of the four kings are still out there on the loose? We're going to play it safe. We're not going to help you. Gideon shows his fierce side when he said, when I have captured those two kings, Zevach and Zalmunna, I'll come back and I will teach you a lesson with desert thorns. And what's more, I'm going to tear down your fortresses. Details are few for what happened next, but Gideon went down into North Arabia, and there was just a tremendous battle between Midianite and other tribes from the Arabian Peninsula, and Gideon captured the two kings that had gotten away so far, and won a great battle at the Pass of Heres in Arabia. He came back to those cities that were on the Jordan River and found a young boy and asked him, write down the names of all the leaders of your towns. Gideon was interested in carrying out punishment for those who had not given him bread. Then Gideon interrogated the two kings whom he had captured, and he said, what kind of people did you execute when you were going about your nasty job of harassing the Israelites? And the interrogation ended with Gideon learning that these two kings had actually executed his own brothers. And Gideon turned to his son who was nearby. We've never met him before. His name was Jephthah. And he said, you execute these two kings for what they did to your uncles. Jephthah was afraid to use the sword in that way, so the kings of Midian said, you know, you measure a guy by what a coward his own son is. That was a taunt, and what happened then is that Gideon simply struck them down, and he took all the different ornaments and things that belonged to the Midianites, and they'll be part of the end of the story. It's here that the Israelites said to Gideon, he had come from battle, he had won a great victory, he had punished those cities that were reluctant to support him, and they said, Gideon, you and your son and your grandson rule over us, be our king. And Gideon's answer was what one would expect of a child of God. No, God in heaven is your king, I will not be your king. Gideon said, but you can do something for me. You can gather all the gold rings and ornaments that you have and throw them into a pile. And I have something in mind to do. Instead of being your king, I'm going to use this gold for an interesting purpose. And what Gideon did is he made a garment of gold called an ephod, and we're told that it was put in his family house in Ophrah, and the people of Israel came and worshipped it. Here is a man who would not be king because God was king, a man who had destroyed idols, and now he was creating one. This chapter ends with a notation that after Gideon's victory, the land had rest for 40 years. It's the last time that we're going to hear this. Gideon, in his retirement, was very busy raising kids. He had many wives, and one of them was a concubine who actually was a Canaanite, a pagan. And she had a son, and Gideon called him Abimelech, which, if you translate to Hebrew, means "my father is king." What are we to make of this? Gideon refused the crown, but he made something that caused the Israelites to have a false worship, and he behaved like a king, and he named one of his children, "My father is king." The sequel to the story of Gideon is that the next oppressor of Israel would not be a foreigner, but would be Gideon's own son, this guy named Abimelech. The people of the area of Shechem, not far from Gideon's home, set up a temple, and they called it Baal Berit. If you translate that, is Baal of the covenant. That's sort of a mixture of the covenant relationship that God had established with Moses and Baal, who was the one that Gideon had destroyed his altar at the beginning of the story. This slide gives us a summary of Gideon's judgeship, of how he carried it on. Tells us where he lived. He brought all the people up to the spring of Herod. God whittled the army down from 32,000 to 300. 3 companies swept down upon the Midianites, and Israel won a great battle up there. It mentions here that in Psalm 83, near the city of Endor, which appears later on in the story of King Saul, is exactly where they won the great victory. And then the sequel to the story, Gideon pursues the Midianites down into Arabia. Ephraim assists Gideon by sealing off the places where you cross the Jordan. He wants to have food and water from these cities on the Jordan. They refuse, and he punishes these cities when he comes back from victory. Finally, Gideon refuses a crown, but set up an ephod, or a worship. He had cut down an altar, and destroyed the altar of Baal, but now he created his own object of worship. A summary. The Israelites had done evil in the eyes of the Lord after the time of Deborah and Barak. God had sold them into the hands of Midian for 7 years. God raised up Gideon, who had an army crafted by God to carry out God's victory. Gideon won that victory, gave the land 40 years of rest, but the people, with Gideon's help, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is cycle number 4. It's right in the center of the story of the Judges. Our lesson today is going to now proceed to introduce not just one judge like Gideon, but numbers 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Not much is told about Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, but there is a lot told about the judge named Jephthah. What was happening here is that these particular judges, first of all, the top two, were on either side of the Jordan, and they defended the nation for a period of time together. Then Jephthah was raised up to fight against a very formidable enemy, the Ammonites, and when that was over, there was going to be 3 judges, one in the north, one in the center, and one in the south, that held the place together. These are cycles 5 and 6 of the book of Judges. We're back to Abimelech, the son of Gideon, the one who had a Canaanite mother. And he said to the people of the city of Shechem, which was right snap dab in the middle of the Holy Land, he made a proposal. What's the better deal for you? Do you want to have Gideon's sons, 70 of them, each being petty rulers, or isn't it better that you just have one man and one of your own, whose mother comes from your city? And he said, he convinced the people of Shechem to make him king. Abimelech gathered some money, and he bought some men. He got a small army, you might say, and he convinced the people of Shechem to follow him. It's a sordid and bloody incident here. What Abimelech did is he rounded up all of his half-brothers and he killed them on one stone. So Gideon's whole family has been exterminated. The only one left is this half-Canaanite, half-Israelite man named Abimelech, and he makes himself king. We're told that this is exactly what the people of Shechem did. Under a sacred tree, they anointed Abimelech as their king. As I said, the book of Judges is a collection of stories, each with a certain amount of meaning that can be used by people to learn principles about God and the way he deals with his people. This particular next incident is about there was one surviving son of Gideon that had not been killed, and his name was Jotham. And he challenged Abimelech by telling a parable. The parable was quite simple. The story is that the trees had a meeting to decide who would be king. And they came to the fig tree and says, or the olive tree, to the olive tree and says, "Be our king." And the olive tree said, "Oh, no, I am successful in giving olive oil to the people. I don't need to be king." And the trees went to the fig tree and says, "Be our king and rule over us." And the fig tree says, "Well, I make sweet fruit and it's on the tables of all the Israelites. I don't think I want to be king. No, I won't." And next the trees came to the grapevine and said, "You be our king." And the grapevine says, "Well, I'm quite successful in making wine for the people. I don't think I want to be king." Finally, they came to the thorn bush and they said, "Would you be king and rule over us?" The first images of trees, the fig, the olive, and the vine, all refer to the good judges that God raised up. But now this guy who wasn't really fit to be king, like a thorn bush, was somebody that they asked to rule over them. And of course the story goes ahead, "Oh, sure, I'll be king, and you can gather around under my thorn bush and have shade." The parable continues by saying, what happens to thorn bushes that are very dry? They catch fire, and they even burn down the mighty cedars of Lebanon. And the picture basically is this guy Abimelech, this thorn bush that you've made king, he's going to burn down every good thing that still exists in Israel. There won't be any rest anymore after he's through. Jotham, who's talking to Abimelech across a valley, says, "Have you acted honorably in making Abimelech king?" He's actually talking to the people of the town. "Have you been fair to Jerubbaal and his family? Have you treated him as he deserves?" He was basically pricking their conscience. "Today you have revolted against my father and his family, and by implication, revolted against God himself." "You have murdered 70 sons on a single stone, and you have made this worthless fellow, this thorn bush, king." "Let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you, the citizens of Shechem. Come out from you, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and consume Abimelech." So you have the one surviving son of Gideon, who basically now is predicting by means of this parable that they had made a completely worthless guy king, and they would pay for it dearly. Jotham, having finished his parable, went and hid out in a well or a cistern, and he lived there and survived because he was afraid, of course, if his brother caught him, he would execute him as well. Well, the prophecy came true in not a long time, but actually a period of 3 years. Abimelech governed Israel as a self-appointed king, you might say. And Abimelech got into arguments with the people of Shechem and the ones that had helped him murder his brothers. Now we're told that in this city of Shechem they had built this temple, a mixture of pagan and godly. It was called Baal Berith, Baal of the Covenant. And they had a festival. This was probably the festival in the fall when wine is made. And they got roaring drunk. And they said, why should we follow this half-breed Abimelech, who's part Israelite, part one of our own? And let's get rid of him and let's serve our Canaanite lords, the family of Hamor. Call out your army. So we got civil war brewing. And the people of Shechem went out onto the roads in which trade was held, and they robbed people on the way. It's basically a picture that things were falling apart. Abimelech wasn't fit to be king. He didn't have a base of people who supported him, and now things were disintegrating. There's a fellow that is introduced into the story. We never will hear of him again. His name was Gaal, son of Ephod. It basically means a good for nothing son of a slave. And he moved into the city, and the people thought he was some hot stuff, much better than Abimelech, and they began to swear allegiance to him. Abimelech had put somebody in charge as governor of the city while he went out and did some conquering, and his name was Zebul. And the next couple of slides will simply outline for us how law and order broke down completely. The governor and the people had been drinking too much. They went out and they looked and they said, don't you see the army coming to cause problems? And no, that's not the army. You're just drunk and you've got bleary eyes. But there was an army coming. The governor that Abimelech had left in town, he says, where's your big talk now? You said Abimelech is not going to be able to be our ruler, but his army is coming, and you could see them coming across. So things are disintegrating. There was a battle, there was an ambush, there was a lot of people killed. Abimelech, who had been crowned king, had been abandoned by his people to follow this guy, Gaal, son of a slave. And now there was internal tension, and there was a battle, and Abimelech killed everybody. And we're actually told that he put salt in the ground so that the city could not be rebuilt. The people retreated into that fortress named Baal of the Covenant. They closed the door behind themselves. And when Abimelech went up to the hills around there, he cut down branches. He told his men to do exactly the same thing. And what they were going to do was rather awful. They put the cut down branches of the trees, and there were lots of them, set them afire, and basically roasted the people inside of the temple. Abimelech, having a great victory, he thought, went to the nearest city, and he thought he was going to do the same thing there. And the people locked themselves into their fortress. And what happened was a woman sitting on the top of this fortress dropped a millstone on the head of Abimelech, basically cracked his head, and he told his servant boy, "Strike me down because I don't want people saying a woman killed me." It was a sad end to a sad story. Abimelech was not fit to be king. He had destroyed the whole city of Shechem in the middle of God's country. Rebellion and confusion were everywhere. So the prophecy or the parable of Jotham that began this section now came true. It was as if fire came out of Abimelech, the thorn bush, and was now burning up the country. And that's exactly how Israel was oppressed, was threatened after the death of Gideon. So just looking at it again, halfway through the book of Judges, we have someone who the people wanted to make king. He said, no, I don't want to be king. But he set up something idolatrous for the people to follow. He had lots of kids, all of whom were killed, but one survived. And he was made king after hiring some good-for-nothings to be his army. Another surviving son of Gideon called him to account and said, "There were better men than you, Abimelech, who were offered a crown, but they refused," referring probably to the judges that preceded Gideon. But this thorn bush of a man, he said, "Fine, I'll be king." And what's going to happen is that the fire of destruction is going to consume the center of the country, and we don't have any more rest for the country. Rest is over. God did not forget, however, that he was the God who loved his people And so he raised up a number 6 judge. His name was Tola. And he was from Ephraim in the center of the country, not far from these awful events that we just talked about. And he was a judge for 23 years. After him, on the other side of Jordan, there was a judge named Yair. He was the 7th judge, and he led Israel for 22 years. Were these 2 judges one after the other, or were they overlapping? I think probably overlapping. So again, we have our summary. This is cycle number 5. The people prostituted themselves to the Baals, and they actually set up a Baal temple called also the Temple of the Covenant, which was wrong. And God then stirred up Abimelech, who made himself king for 3 years. And then he set up 2 judges, one in the west and one in the east. And for a cumulative of 45 years, either probably overlapping, and the end result was the country had no rest at all, and still they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals, the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, that was Syria, the gods of Sidon, that's Phoenicia, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. These last 2 peoples would become the next scourge to give Israel problems. God became angry with the people because they're basically worshiping any god but him. A summary. The Philistines and the Ammonites. The Philistines came along the Mediterranean coast, and the Ammonites came from the desert edge on the east. And just like 2 armies that are squeezing the middle, they were moving against the Israelites like this. The Philistines would stay around for 40 years, but the Ammonites only for 18. The Ammonites were the first major concern of the Israelites. They lived along the desert edge. Here's the Dead Sea, there's the Jordan, and they attacked and they crossed the Jordan, and they were squeezing Israel from the east. God admonished his people, "You have forsaken me and served other gods. I'm done with giving you rest. You won't have it anymore. Go cry out to the gods that you have chosen." It's a very sad turn of events. As often happens when people really are caught, they say, "Oh, we've sinned. Please rescue us now." And the people did get rid of the gods and goddesses that they had put in their houses and on their fields. And God, because he is a God of mercy and grace, answered them. But we can see that the quality of the judges was deteriorating. Gideon was someone who won a great victory, but he was also someone not above causing the people to sin. This would continue. The battle lines were being drawn. The Ammonites were camped in Gilead on the east of the Jordan. The people of Gilead on the east of the Jordan said to each other, "Whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all of us who live in Gideon." Didn't use the word king, didn't use the word judge, but said will be the head. What we see here is that there was nobody in Gilead willing to take that on themselves, but they were looking around for someone who could be their leader. We're introduced to the next judge, number 8, Jephthah, whose name means the one who opens up things. Now we're told that he had an Israelite father, but that his mother was a prostitute. So again, the quality of the judges was deteriorating. When this Jephthah became a teenager or a young man, his half-brothers, who had Israelite mothers, drove Jephthah out of the house. And the reason for that is because you're the son of, quote, another woman. You aren't fit to be our leader. So where did Jephthah go? He went into a place called Tov. He gathered a group of scoundrels and ruffians. He became a leader of bandits, you might say. He had been rejected by his own brethren, but he was a very fierce fighter. The people of Gilead, who couldn't produce a leader of their own, came to Jephthah and they said, "Be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites." And Jephthah says quite properly, "Well, you didn't like me at all. You threw me out. Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The people said, "Never mind, we're serious. We will make you the head over all of us." And Jephthah says, "You really mean it? You're going to make me head over all of you?" And the Israelites said, "As the Lord is our witness, we certainly will." So they were putting all of their confidence in a man who was the son of a prostitute who had been kicked out of his ancestral home, who was the leader of a band of ruffians. This is how low the quality of the Israelites had sunk. They made him head and commander, and they gathered the Israelites at a place called Mizpah. Mizpah simply means lookout. There are a number of Mizpahs on both sides of the Jordan, but there was one place near Jerusalem which appears in the book of Joshua and Judges, and I think that's the one that they gathered together at to fight the Ammonites. Remember, the Ammonites had crossed the Jordan River and were pressing the Israelites on both sides. Next slides are going to tell us that Jephthah, even though his pedigree, his background was not so good, was a learned man. He knew the stories, he knew about Israel's history, and he was a negotiator. He went to the king of the Ammonites, and Jephthah sent messengers, and he says, "When Israel came out of Egypt, I have attacked them because they took away my lands. Ammon says, we were right. The Israelites had stole our country. We're simply taking back what's ours. And we're talking now about diplomatic letters between Jephthah and the king of the Ammonites. And Jephthah says, no, we didn't take the land from you. We took the land from the people who lived in this area who were not Ammonites and were not Moabites. They were the two kings, Sihon and Og. And the story went that the Israelites were bent on going to the promised land and not taking any of the land from all the other peoples. And they did not take the land of the Edomites. They did not take the land of the Moabites, who had been given their land by God. Those two nations were descended from Abraham. So the story goes on. The Israelites went carefully around these nations. They did not enter the territory of Moab. They did not take away the land of you, O king. And then he talks about how Israel defeated Sihon, who would not let the Israelites pass through, and conquered their land. How do we summarize? The Ammonites had no right to invade and try to capture the tribal lands of the Israelites, because the God had given them that land when they entered the promised land after leaving Egypt. Our God has given us this land. King, you have no right to challenge our ownership of the promised land. If you read the words of Jephthah, you could see he was very well informed about the history of Israel 300 years earlier. And he says, we've been here for 300 years. That's our story. That's the truth. I have not wronged you, Jephthah said, but you are doing wrong to me. The king of the Ammonites paid no attention at all to the argumentation of Jephthah, so now there's war. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he advanced against the Ammonites, crossed the Jordan, attacked them, and was about to win a great victory. The story shifts now from battles and defending the country of Israel to Jephthah's ill-considered, bad idea. He made a vow. He said, the first thing that comes out of my house will be offered to the Lord as an olah, as a burnt offering, if I am successful and if I win the battle. That's a kind of oath or promise that was not very well thought through. You don't know who's going to come out of your house. In ancient Israel, these houses were open to the sky, and animals often lived in the courtyard, but also people did. This is a battle map. You can see that Jephthah attacked from the northwest, then straight to the south. He devastated 20 towns. Israel subdued Ammon. Jephthah was the victor. Now this is the sad story. Jephthah had won the victory. He came to his home. Who came out to meet him? His only daughter. She was an only child. He had no other children. And you can just feel when he said, "Oh no, daughter. Now what do I do? I am devastated. But I made a vow to the Lord. I can't break it." The daughter was respectful to her father. She says, "You have given your word to the Lord. I will have to be dedicated." That's what an olah is, to the Lord. "I will not give me a couple of months with my girlfriends because I will never marry. I'll never have kids. You will never be a grandpa." So they went into the hills and mourned for this eventuality that she would give her father no children. The Bible simply says, after this time with her girlfriends, she returned to her father, and the Bible says he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. People have debated exactly what happened. Did he actually make a human sacrifice and kill his daughter? Some people say yes, but the text doesn't say that. God had asked Abraham to take his only son Isaac up to the mountain and to make him an olah, a total sacrifice to God. But we know from that story that the angel did not allow Isaac to die on the altar. I'm inclined to believe that the same thing was true here. The sad thing was that Jephthah would be left childless, no grandchildren, and his daughter would die a virgin. We return to the Ephraimites, who are always making objections to the way God's judges were conducting their work. And the Ephraimites complained to Jephthah, says, "Why didn't you ask us, the great fighters of Ephraim, to go with you? We're going to go and burn down your house and everything that you have." If you get the idea that things were falling apart, it's true. Jephthah did not do what Gideon had done when he said, "Oh, what you Ephraimites done is nothing to compete, is much better than what we from my clan have done." No, he didn't do that at all. He simply says, "When I needed help, when I called for help, you Ephraimites stayed at home. You didn't help me at all. I'm not going to accept your argumentation that I failed to call you." Jephthah called together his men of Gilead, and basically they made war against Ephraim. You have here now a civil war on top of everything else. The Jordan was there right between the Ephraimites on the west and Jephthah and his people in Gilead on the right. And when the people tried to get away from Jephthah, this war was ongoing. It's very interesting. They asked the people of Ephraim who were getting away to say a Hebrew word. Because of dialect differences, the Ephraimites could not say shh. So, say the word shibboleth. They couldn't say it that way. And that was the reason that at the fords of the Jordan, they were able to determine who was to be executed and killed and who was to be spared. Jephthah's story is outlined here. He was born and raised in Gilead, number 1 here. He led a band of men up here, country of Tob. The Ammonites moved across the Jordan to oppress Israel. At Mizpah of Benjamin, I believe, Jephthah was asked to be the head of the Israelite army. 5, he carried on diplomacy with the king of the Ammonites. 6, Jephthah successfully makes war against the Ammonites. And Jephthah met his daughter near a place called Zephon, that was right here. The men of Ephraim took offense at Jephthah's wartime tactics and attacked his victorious army, that's number 8. And the Gileadites defeated the unhappy Ephraimites and cut them down at the Jordan. If you look at this picture, what a difference this was from the first judge. Things were truly falling apart. Our story today is going to come to a close quickly with Judges 8. Well, that's Jephthah 8, and he only judged for 6 years, not 20 or 40 or 80. He died and was buried in Gilead. And now we have Judges 9, 10, and 11. The next one is Ibzan. He came from the city of Bethlehem. We know Bethlehem because that's where Ruth and Boaz lived. That's where King David would come from. He led Israel for 7 years, and he used marriage between his children and the people around to kind of hold things together. The next judge is Elon. His name means oak. We aren't told about his tactics at all. He lived in the north, in the tribe of Zebulun, and he judged for 10 years. And number 11 out of the 12 who judged for 8 years was Abdon, and he was from the center of the country, and we're told that he had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, and they rode on donkeys. That meant that they were princes. And these 3 men, very short stories, tell us that God had compassion on his people even after they had messed things up terribly, and he still sent men to be judges over Israel. This is the end of our lesson for today. The next time we will be introduced to the 12th and final judge, who in some respects was the most surprising of them all. His name was Samson. And then we will have the story about the period of the judges, 4 pictures that depict the family, the tribe, the religious leaders, and the nation, certainly not in a favorable light. So we complete today with a slide showing the same pattern, but again without any rest happening. And look at how many people are involved in this stage. It's the 6th cycle. The Ammonites are the ones who are causing problem. 18 years they afflict the Israelites. God raises up Jephthah in the east across Jordan. And then after him, you've got Ibzan in the south, Elon in the north, and Abdon in the center. And you can see the number of years that 6, 8, 10, 7. These are not long judgeships. But the bottom line is the country had no rest. And the people still did evil in the eyes of the Lord.